Welcome back to Finance Empire Real Life Stories. Before we begin today's story, I want you to think about something for a moment. What would happen if the person who knew you best suddenly became the person you trusted the least? Imagine growing up with someone who shared your childhood, your family dinners, your secrets, your happiest memories. And then one day, because of money, pride, and one house, you could barely look each other in the eye anymore. Today's story is emotional, painful, and honestly very real for many families around the world. This is not just a story about inheritance. It's a story about grief, misunderstanding, ego, and the heartbreaking truth that sometimes people lose each other while trying to win. As you listen, pay attention to the English vocabulary about legal conflict, family relationships, emotional arguments, and property disputes. And trust me, this story will keep getting more intense with every chapter. So grab your coffee, relax, and let's step into today's real-life story. The house on Oak Street had always felt alive. Even during difficult times, there was warmth inside those walls. The smell of homemade soup drifting from the kitchen, the sound of old jazz records playing on Sunday mornings, the tiny scratches on the hallway walls from years of childhood games. For Julian and Clara, the house was never just a building. It was their entire history. After their mother passed away, silence settled over the home like a thick winter fog. The funeral had ended 2 days earlier, but neither sibling felt ready to leave. Every room carried a memory. Every chair seemed to hold an invisible shadow of the woman who had raised them alone after their father disappeared decades earlier. That evening, rain tapped softly against the living room windows, while Clara sat curled up on the old velvet couch, holding a warm mug of tea. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and exhaustion hung over her like a heavy blanket. Julian stood near the fireplace, quietly staring at a framed family photograph taken almost 20 years ago. In the picture, their mother smiled proudly while Julian and Clara laughed beside her, wearing matching winter coats. "It feels wrong that she's gone," Clara whispered softly. "Like the world made some kind of mistake." Julian nodded slowly. "I keep expecting to hear her walking down the hallway." The grief between them created a strange closeness. For those first few days, they moved like teammates carrying the same emotional weight. They cooked meals together, answered condolence calls together, and sat in silence together long after midnight. At one point, Clara rested her head on Julian's shoulder, exactly the way she used to during thunderstorms when they were children. For a brief moment, it felt like nothing in the world could break the bond between them. But grief changes shape very quickly. At first, it feels like sadness. Then slowly it transforms into stress, confusion, fear, and resentment. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, while Julian flipped through unopened mail stacked beside the toaster. Insurance papers, medical bills, bank notices, documents everywhere. Clara entered wearing one of their mother's oversized sweaters and leaned against the counter. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Julian rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I guess we figure everything out one step at a time." At that moment, neither of them realized that the house sitting around them would soon become a battlefield. 3 days later, they sat inside the office of Mr. Henderson, their mother's longtime attorney. The room felt cold and sterile compared to the warmth of the family home. Tall shelves filled with dusty legal books surrounded them while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder carefully. "Your mother loved both of you deeply," he began in a calm voice. "She wanted the house to remain in the family." Julian expected a simple conversation, probably a straightforward 50-50 split, followed by selling the property and dividing the money. Easy, clean, logical. But the moment the lawyer began reading the will, the atmosphere changed completely. The house would remain under joint ownership for at least 5 years. Neither sibling could sell the property without written agreement from the other. Any renovations, rentals, or financial decisions required unanimous consent. Clara's stomach dropped instantly. Her business had been struggling for months, though she rarely admitted it openly. She had secretly been hoping her half of the inheritance would solve her financial problems. Meanwhile, Julian felt the opposite reaction. A hidden sense of relief washed over him. He had quietly imagined moving his own family into the old house someday, The same document that terrified Clara gave Julian hope. And that was the exact moment everything started breaking apart. When they walked out of the lawyer's office, the air between them felt different. Not hostile yet, but tense, uncomfortable. Clara stopped beside the parking lot and crossed her arms tightly. "So what now?" she asked. Julian hesitated. "We keep the place maintained. We think carefully before making decisions." Clara stared at him. "You sound like you already know what you want." He looked away. "I'm just trying to be responsible." The word responsible irritated her immediately. It sounded less like concern and more like judgment. That night, neither of them slept well. The next week, they returned to the house to begin sorting through their mother's belongings. At first, they tried to keep things civil. They opened old boxes in the attic and laughed over embarrassing childhood photos. Julian discovered an ancient baseball glove hidden under a pile of blankets. Clara found stacks of handwritten birthday cards their mother had saved for decades. For short moments, the old connection returned. But underneath every conversation was a growing awareness of ownership. Who gets what? Who deserves what? Who sacrificed more? Those thoughts slowly poisoned everything. One afternoon, Julian walked through the dining room carrying a laser measuring tool and a notebook. Clara frowned immediately. "What are you doing?" "Just checking dimensions," he replied casually. "The roof probably needs repairs soon." Her expression hardened. "You're already calculating property value." "I'm being practical, Clara." "Practical?" she repeated sharply. "Mum died 2 weeks ago." Julian sighed heavily. "And taxes still exist. Maintenance still exists. Reality still exists." The argument ended quickly, but the emotional damage stayed behind. From that moment on, every interaction carried hidden meaning. When Julian suggested hiring an appraiser, Clara heard greed. When Clara delayed paperwork discussions, Julian saw irresponsibility. They stopped interpreting each other with kindness. And once kindness disappears from a relationship, every sentence starts sounding like an attack. A few days later, rain hammered against the roof while they worked inside the attic sorting old storage boxes. Dust floated through narrow beams of grey light. Clara carefully unwrapped a silver jewellery box that had belonged to their grandmother. "Mum once told me she wanted Lily to have this someday," Clara said softly, referring to her daughter. Julian looked up from an old trunk. "I remember her saying it should stay with the house." Clara froze. "With the house?" "Yeah." "You mean with you?" Julian crossed his arms. "I'm just telling you what I remember." The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. Clara stood up slowly. Stood up. "You've already decided you're keeping the house, haven't you?" "That's not what I said." "But it's what you mean." Julian's patience finally cracked. "At least I was here, Clara." The words hit her like a slap. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means while you were building your career in another state, I was the one driving Mum to appointments and fixing broken pipes and handling emergencies." Clara's face flushed with anger. "So now you think you loved her more?" "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The argument exploded from there. Years of buried resentment suddenly poured out into the open. Missed birthdays, old jealousy, different lifestyles, unspoken insecurities. None of it was really about the house anymore. The inheritance simply became the match that ignited emotions they had buried for years. That evening, Clara drove home shaking with anger while replaying every word in her mind. For the first time in her life, she felt suspicious of her own brother. Meanwhile, Julian sat alone in the empty kitchen, staring at the family photographs on the refrigerator. He hated the argument. But part of him also believed he was right. That's the dangerous thing about family conflicts. Nobody feels like the villain. Both sides feel wounded. Both sides feel justified. And once people become convinced they are protecting themselves, they stop noticing the damage they're causing others. The following weekend, new voices entered the situation. Julian's wife Sarah began analysing the property like a financial investment. She pointed out rising housing prices, future rental opportunities, and long-term equity. "If Clara forces a sale right now, you'll regret it forever," she warned him. Across town, Clara's boyfriend Mark had his own opinion. "He's manipulating you," Mark insisted, while reviewing legal documents at a cafe table. "He wants to trap you into a bad deal." Little by little, outside influence poured gasoline onto the fire. Phone calls became colder. Text messages became formal. Every conversation sounded rehearsed instead of natural. Soon lawyers entered the picture. And once lawyers become the main form of communication between siblings, the relationship is already standing on the edge of collapse. By the end of that month, the warmth inside the Oak Street house had disappeared completely. The building still stood exactly the same. On the outside, same porch, same windows, same garden. But emotionally, it had transformed into something unrecognizable. It was no longer a home filled with childhood memories. It had become territory. And the war had only just begun. What started as grief was turning into bitterness. What started as love was slowly turning into pride. And in part 2, things become even more intense. The legal battle grows uglier. Shocking accusations are made, and one moment on the front lawn changes their relationship forever. Trust me, you do not want to miss the next part of this story. The following week felt colder, even though summer had already arrived. Something invisible had changed between Julian and Clara after the attic argument. The warmth that once existed naturally between them was gone, replaced by awkward pauses, guarded conversations, and silent suspicion. The strange thing about family conflict is that it rarely explodes all at once. It grows slowly, quietly, like a crack spreading across glass. At first, the siblings still tried pretending everything was normal. They exchanged polite greetings. They discussed groceries for the house. They talked about paperwork in calm voices. But underneath every sentence was tension, waiting for an excuse to rise. One rainy afternoon, Clara arrived at the Oak Street house carrying several grocery bags. She stepped into the kitchen and immediately noticed new locks installed on the back door. Her expression tightened. "Why are the locks different?" she asked sharply. Julian barely looked up from the dining table where he was reviewing bills. "Because the old ones were rusted. You changed them without telling me. I gave you a copy of the new key." "That's not the point." Julian finally sighed and placed the papers down. "Everything becomes a problem with you lately." Clara laughed bitterly. "Because every week you make another decision without asking me." The room filled with silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky. Julian rubbed his temples tiredly. "Clara, we can't fight over every tiny thing. Then stop acting like the house already belongs to you." That sentence hung heavily in the air. Julian stood up slowly from his chair. "You know what? Maybe I care more because I was actually here." "There you go again," Clara snapped immediately. "You keep acting like I abandoned Mom. You left. I moved for work. And I stayed." The argument escalated quickly, voices bouncing off the kitchen walls that once held birthday dinners and Christmas laughter. Years earlier, those same walls had heard two children laughing over board games and sneaking cookies after bedtime. Now they listened to accusations. Clara slammed her hands against the countertop. "You think being physically close made you a better child?" "No," Julian replied coldly. "But it made me the one handling reality, while you visited twice a year pretending everything was fine." The words cut deeply because part of Clara feared they might contain some truth. She had spent years building her career in another city. Long hours, constant travel, missed holidays. At first she told herself it was temporary, that one day she would slow down and spend more time with family. But life moves faster than people expect. Suddenly years disappear, and now their mother was gone forever. Clara grabbed her purse angrily. "I can't even stand being in the same room with you right now." As she stormed toward the door, Julian called after her. "You always run away when things get uncomfortable." She stopped instantly. For one brief second, it looked like she might turn around and say something devastating. But instead, she simply walked out into the rain. Julian stood alone in the kitchen, breathing heavily. The house felt emptier than ever. Later that night, Clara sat inside her apartment, replaying the argument over and over in her mind. Her boyfriend Mark sat across from her, scrolling through financial documents on his laptop. "He's manipulating the situation," Mark said firmly. "He wants emotional control over the house because he knows you need liquidity." Clara stared at her untouched cup of coffee. "I don't even recognize him anymore." Mark leaned forward. "Then stop treating this emotionally. Treat it legally." Those words planted a dangerous seed in her mind. Meanwhile, across town, Julian sat at his own kitchen table with his wife Sarah. "You need boundaries," Sarah insisted while reviewing property tax estimates. If Clara forces a sale now, the property value won't reach its full potential. Julian looked exhausted. She's my sister, Sarah. And she's also threatening your future. The more advice both siblings received from outside voices, the worse things became. Soon every conversation sounded strategic instead of honest. Every text message felt carefully calculated. Then came the lawyers. At first it was subtle. Just consultations. Simple questions about inheritance law. But once attorneys became involved, the emotional atmosphere changed completely. One Monday morning, Julian opened his mailbox and found an official legal envelope from Clara's attorney. His chest tightened instantly. The letter requested detailed financial records related to the property, along with formal clarification regarding maintenance expenses and occupancy intentions. The cold legal language made his stomach twist. Petitioner, respondent, asset distribution, disputed ownership. No mention of brother or sister anywhere, just legal terminology. Julian sat down heavily at the kitchen table, reading the document 3 times. Every sentence felt like another brick being placed in a wall between them. For several minutes he considered calling Clara directly. Part of him desperately wanted to say, "What are we doing? How did we become this?" But pride stopped him. Instead, he called his own lawyer. And just like that, the battle officially began. The following weeks became emotionally exhausting. The siblings stopped communicating directly. Everything passed through attorneys, emails, or formal notices. Simple conversations that once took 30 seconds now required legal review. The house itself began changing too. Without warmth and regular life inside it, the Oak Street home started feeling hollow. Dust gathered faster. The silence became uncomfortable. One afternoon, Julian walked through the empty hallway and noticed faint pencil marks still visible near the kitchen doorframe, their childhood height chart. He traced his fingers across the faded lines. Age 8, age 11, age 14. For a moment, emotion cracked through his anger. He suddenly remembered Clara crying during thunderstorms when she was little. He remembered teaching her how to ride a bicycle. He remembered the 2 of them sleeping beside the Christmas tree because they were too excited to wait for morning. The memories hit him hard. How could 2 people share an entire childhood and still end up here? That same evening, Clara visited the house while Julian was away. She moved quietly through the living room, carrying empty storage boxes. The silence felt haunting. As she packed old photo albums into cardboard containers, she discovered a tiny porcelain bird sitting behind a stack of books on the fireplace mantel, their mother's favourite decoration. Clara picked it up carefully and felt tears suddenly burn in her eyes. The bird wasn't valuable. It probably cost less than $20. But emotionally, it felt priceless. That tiny object represented safety, childhood, home, and the version of her family that no longer existed. For several minutes, she simply stood there holding it while memories flooded her mind. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Julian had returned unexpectedly. Their eyes met instantly. Neither spoke at first. The atmosphere felt painfully tense. Finally, Julian glanced at the porcelain bird in her hands. "You're taking that too?" he asked quietly. The question sounded small, but beneath it lived months of resentment. Clara's expression hardened immediately. "Seriously, I'm just asking." "No, Julian, you're accusing." He shook his head tiredly. "You act like I'm the enemy." "Because you treat me like one." Julian laughed bitterly. "You hired a lawyer first. Because you started making decisions behind my back. And you started acting like selling the house mattered more than Mum's memory." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "That's unbelievably unfair." "Is it?" The argument exploded again, this time louder than before, angrier than before. Words flew through the living room like knives. Old insecurities resurfaced. Old childhood jealousy resurfaced. Everything ugly that had stayed buried for years suddenly came alive. At one point, Clara's voice cracked with emotion. "You know what hurts most? I lost Mum too, Julian. But every time we talk, you act like your grief matters more than mine." For the first time, Julian looked shaken. Because underneath all the fighting, both of them were still grieving, still hurting, still emotionally drowning in different ways. But neither one knew how to comfort the other anymore. And that's the tragedy of unresolved pain. Sometimes people become so focused on defending themselves that they forget the other person is wounded too. Outside, rain hammered against the windows, while thunder shook the house softly. The same house that once protected them as children now echoed with bitterness and heartbreak. And neither sibling realised it yet, but things were about to become far worse. Because in part 2, the legal war turns public, shocking accusations are made in front of neighbours, and one devastating moment on the front lawn changes their relationship forever. And trust me, after that moment, nothing between Julian and Clara will ever be the same again.